My name is Minka vanBeuzekom, D-A-N-B-E-U Z-E-K-O-M, vanBeuzekom. And I should have people practice that because there have been like 15 or 20 different ways to pronounce it. So it's really pretty straightforward, vanBeuzekom. Anyway, so yes, I am a Cambridge City Councilor. I live at 20 Essex Street in Cambridge. And Central Square, I believe, is the heart of Cambridge. But this neighborhood, as you all know from the great turnout here, really has its own little heart. It's a wonderful neighborhood, and you don't often find such a well-integrated community. So I think that their points about the size, the scale, the fact that it doesn't fit into what's been created here heretofore is really important to listen to, and I know that you will. Keeping the scale of this building or of these units that need to be for financial reasons built makes sense, but the way it's constructed is just, it doesn't fit in, and you've heard that many times. I also want to reiterate what Dara said about the gated community. As you know, I was here when Novartis wanted to gate off their courtyard, and we are not a gated community. This is Cambridge. We are open. MIT's campus is open. Harvard's campus is open. Novartis's campus will be open once that's built, and creating a gated community here just is not compatible as well with the spirit. I also want to question a little bit the traffic studies. So this part of Cambridge does not have the high adoption rate of using alternative means of transportation. And the traffic study makes the same assumptions. About 50% of people will use things other than cars to get around. And the traffic study, based on guidelines from the city, requires that you try to predict out into the future what additional traffic will be based on what you know is coming down the pike in terms of other buildings. And normally, the city has said you have to do that with a 0.5% increase each year. And Sue Clippinger very wisely said, no, well, let's do 1%. But I think this situation with what's happening so close by, that 1% figure is also completely not relevant to the reality that we know is coming. So I really urge you, I know you will do it based on what you've heard, the articulate neighbors talking. I urge you to really take all those things into consideration when you continue to try to shape this project. Thank you.
Well, among the issues I'd like to see addressed, certainly I'd like to, the biggest issue that I see is not the number of units, is not the FAR or the density per se, but rather the massing and the form of the building. Certainly one of the criteria for the issuance of our special permits is consistency with the established patterns of development on the street and the neighborhood, and whatever else may be said about the appeal or desirability of the design, it's certainly of a different nature and massing than the surrounding buildings. It's a funny thing that if it had been an existing building, an existing mill or factory or what have you of that scale, and it was a rehab of the existing building, I'd say, well, that's one thing. It's part of the existing fabric and sort of industrial history of the neighborhood. But as a new building, I'm not sure that that approach as a single monolithic building is the way to go, and I'd really like to see the applicant at least present other options as to how the number of units could be organized and arranged on the site. In my mind, that's the overarching premier issue on the site. I mean, there are a number of subsidiary issues. Certainly, the relationship between the site and the linear park, and how that border is done, and what the fencing is, and I think I think in terms of affording access from the surrounding neighborhood to the linear park would be important in terms of walkways and access points. The traffic we've certainly heard a great deal about the traffic here. I guess that's a secondary issue. On the one hand, I'm inclined to assign great weight to the evaluation of the city's traffic department. And yet, when you hear about these streets, I mean, it certainly does raise concerns. And I note in the traffic department's letter that they point out the virtue of having 5 separate access points to the site, and I thought that was an important point. And while I am certainly understanding and empathetic to the views of the residents of Brookford Street, I still am troubled by the notion that a new development here is going to have an impact on the traffic patterns of the neighborhood, and will have an impact on the residents of these various streets, except for one street. Unless there's a really good reason in the nature and the geometry and in the configuration of that street, it's difficult for me to see why it wouldn't be advantageous and in the best interest overall for that street to, sort of, bear its fair share of the traffic consequences here. And I guess I would want to hear more from the applicant and Mr. Rafferty on that as to exactly what that court order says, and whether in fact the circumstances that the order was originally intended to address no longer prevail in the site. I think I've said enough.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of what we asked the folks to do at the public hearing, I agree with everything you just said. Basically, I mean, this is a difficult site. It's difficult for all sorts of reasons. One, the goal we have in the zoning that we have passed is to take these kinds of industrial sites and make them residential properties. And the reality is that in most cases, that does give us a site that has a density that's more than most people would like if they were sort of starting from scratch. This also has the particular problem that the Bishop petition was passed, and the Bishop petition it does kind of limit you. I mean, it has limits on the height, it has limits on some of the dimensions, so that there is it kind of defines an envelope that you can kind of work within. That being said, I definitely agree that I have a note here that says were studies done to within the limits of what the Bishop petition has. Did you look at some options in trying to make it less massively one building? In my mind, I think the number of units have been reduced from what could have been done before by the Bishop petition. So it's not. I agree with you. It's not the number of units, the size of the units based on the size of the land area just does have its limits. But I'm interested in just knowing if you even looked at in preliminary studies what it could be. And I'm interested in seeing some of those options. If you didn't, I'm interested in just seeing what the ramifications can be. The idea of selling the properties, it's interesting. It's an interesting balance, which I'm not quite sure how I feel about, but I can see the balance by having 4 properties there that can be developed in something that's of a very residential scale. Has its advantages, but the trade-off is that then you have something that is going to be bigger and denser. And so that I'm just not sure how all those pieces work. I think this is an interesting thing because we've you all don't know it, but we've been sitting through very long and lengthy meetings about Central Square and Kendall Square, and I find this interesting because in Kendall Square we have a series of fairly large parcel of land which has a small number of relatively large owners, and then in Central Square we have parcels of land which has a lot of small owners, and this one's kind of a, even though it's a much smaller piece, it's an amalgamation of the two. We have a lot of small property owners who actually exist there, who a lot of you represent, and then we have a very large piece of land that needs to be developed. And from a master planning point of view, and that term has been used many times tonight, I really think it's the city's responsibility to kind of give us a little bit more focus, because so much of the problems here, particularly with the streets and the traffic, is just out of the control of this one single landowner. I mean, the landowner is landlocked. We pass zoning to encourage this kind of development, but yet, and believe me, I've come down Cottage Ave because in the course of the many things that have come to us in this area, including the condominium complex on Cottage Avenue, I've driven down there, and I can't imagine, it's the turning from Mass Ave on the Cottage Ave it's even your model outside makes it seem a lot more, with the little cars on it, makes it seem a lot more robust than it is. So this idea of at least understanding how those 5 streets work, Tyler Court and Cottage Ave, and I think at least with the traffic department in the city, I think we just need to have a better understanding of, if you think of this not as just one site that's being developed, but a neighborhood that we're trying to do, I'd really like to see the city kind of get into it a little and just help us out with some thoughts on how to make this work. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that it seems very, even though I understand the history of why it happened, to have a development of this size and this scale in this neighborhood, and to have Brookford Street just totally out of the picture, just doesn't make any sense to me. So I will, having said all that, I do need to say, however, that in general, if I look at what's there now, I don't have too much of a problem with an approach that tries to develop this. I do think the scale of the building, I'd like to see some options on that. And I'm just going to go through a few things, just a little bit more specific things that I'd like to make sure we talk about. The fence clearly is something, I literally, when I heard you said there was a chain link fence with stuff growing on it, that didn't go over very well in my ears. I think on the development of this scale, that fence is such a critical part of just what's going to make this right, that at least I'd like to hear some options on what can happen there that makes it reasonable. The whole idea of and I don't know if you've looked at this already in terms of fire and fire access, and as I look at that, I even try to, having gone through several of those exercises, in other places and in other forums with city fire departments, where they really are concerned about where the trucks come in and the turning radiuses and stuff like that. I'd like at least a little clarity on that. I'm assuming that you've probably done some of that, and probably traffic and parking has looked into that issue, but I'd like to know what it is too. I talked about Mass Ave and traffic and all of these ways of getting around. The linear park access, I agree wholeheartedly that there should be more than the one access. I'm not quite sure. I think Mr. Rafferty, you implied that there was some reason for not having the access on the other side, nearer to Magoon or Brookfield. But I just think unless there's some problem that the neighbors have or something, I think just being able to have at least pedestrian access on more than one side makes a lot of sense to me. I'm also interested in how deliverables and how it works in terms of, if you have UPS trucks or FedEx trucks and stuff going in there, and also how trash is going to be managed, and how the snow is going to be managed in terms of removal in the winter. I'd like I think the issue of the issue of the address. I just like to get the city to say it. I mean, how much leeway does the proponent have in sort of picking their address on this? I think given the traffic problems, I think the point was made that given that address, it's going to take a lot of traffic down. What I think is probably one of the worst streets in there, as far as access, Cottage Ave. But I'm just not sure if that's I'd just like some clarity as to, if that's an issue, and does that make any difference. I talked about I think it's the city's responsibility, I think, to look at this Brookford Street issue and to see, given the change and the fact that we're redeveloping it, if it makes logical sense to try to do something better to make the site work from a traffic perspective. That's better. I'd just like some clarity on the clean site issues and if there's any hazardous material. You know, there was this talk about the gardens, and then the gardens wasn't a clean site. And I just wanted to be clear as to what that is. And if there are any, this issue of the other parkers too, the people who, are there any kind of binding contracts or whatever on the site for the people who are currently parking that we're displacing because we're in, if that's going to cause some problem elsewhere. I just want a little bit more clarity there. I think when we talk, we can talk about the differences between the Cambridge Lumber site. Obviously, there's a much smaller unit count there, so that, that there's some issues around that, but that's something we can discuss as we're starting to talk about it. And people have talked about this as a gated community. As I look at it, it's not quite a gated community, because I define a gated community where you actually have to drive, you are prevented from driving in. This is a gated parking lot, which I think it should be. But I wouldn't quite call it a gated community, other than the fact that its configuration at the end of very long streets kind of can give you that feel. But I think calling it a gated community is probably not quite the right perspective. And at that, I think I've said enough and can pick up other things as we go along.
Well, I have a couple of your comments on my list here too, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to quickly go down some of my issues. Did the landscape person talk? The person in charge of landscaping? No. They didn't. They didn't. Okay. So they should. Yeah. So my issue is, of course, the chain link fence, because having gone to the studio and looked at it a lot, it's really ugly. And we have a little chain link fence in the back of our property, and it's only 3 feet tall. But what you can do, I'm really into landscaping. But anyway, what you can do is plant yews there, and the yews will cover the chain link fence very nicely, and they grow to be like 10 feet tall and whatever, and they grow quickly, and they require very little maintenance. So that's just one suggestion to cover the chain link fence, and it will be very, add privacy and be very nice. The height of the building, I have an issue with. The penthouses and the rooftop mechanicals. The fire safety issues with the fire trucks coming in and out. Billy mentioned that. Rental versus buying. I would love to see these made into condos instead, so that people have, can set down roots and make this more of a neighborhood. That's just my opinion. What is the address? Is it 1 Tyler Court? Is it Cottage Park Avenue? Again, you said to what is it? Yes. Certainly the Cambridge Lumber is only 22 units versus these are 67 units, but I am concerned about the massing. I would like to see it a little bit smaller, perhaps broken up. The massing is an issue for me. And the traffic and the parking, of course. That needs to be really looked at a little closer. And in terms of the dance studio, the good news is that it's going to be torn down, because after dancing there, the rugs had mold in it. There was no ventilation. It was a really difficult place to dance. I did the hula, and you have to dance in bare feet, and I would always get splinters in my feet, and it was just really awful. But, the thing is that it's, to see the little kids doing the Irish step dance, and, it was such a delightful thing to see these little kids doing modern dance or ballet or Irish step dancing. I was like amazed, how can I do that? So anyway, if I had a magic wand, and this has nothing perhaps to do with the project, but if I had a magic wand, I would love to see the maybe the City Arts Council do something to try to help Deborah, I forget her last name. Mason, thank you. Do something to perhaps find a place where there can be, because dance is art, and find a place where that could be replaced. So those are just some of my comments. Thank you.
Most of my comments have already been brought up by my colleagues. And so I'm not going to, I'll just say that I didn't hear any of their concerns that I thought were differing from my view of the project. The big question here is exactly what Steve said. Should this be a townhouse development or a development of multiple smaller buildings? Or do we say what's been designed here is, from a bird's eye view, is a big building, but from a pedestrian's eye view is in fact a roughly 10-unit building on Cottage Park at the end, another 10-unit building, the same mirror image, seen from the end of Whittemore Avenue, and then a stealth section in the middle that is difficult to see unless you're in the parking lot. So it will present itself not as a steamship, but as, and then if you look at the way in which the architecture of the end is expressed, it's expressed actually as 3 or 4 separate buildings that are attached to each other. So what that gives you is lots of open space, because you take the space that would be slivered up between buildings and combine it. But you're not necessarily using the open space to the best advantage. I would like to see a plan for community gardens. I would like to see that there are enough gardens so that persons who are living in this project, if they're renters and don't have access to the ground, have it, but also that there be twice as many as that number so that people in the neighborhood can do it. I think you've got the land, and it's messy. It's actually, it looks messy. It's a lovely mess in the summer. It's kind of a sad mess in the winter, but you know, some things that are very good look messy sometimes. And I will say that I have ridden my bicycle from Linear Park to Whittemore Avenue down the path that was described, and I will say that it's everything that the description made of it, but I managed to get through. I was dismayed to discover that I couldn't get Whittemore Avenue back onto the site, that the fence was really very effective. And so I ended up actually bicycling down each of the connecting streets just because I was there and wondering on myself. I also would love to see a plan that accommodates Marina Center parking in some fashion. I think, you know, it's an important community resource, and we lose a lot if they can't function. Now, they may have other options that I don't know, but I think maybe they may need some assistance to explore some of those options, and maybe some of those options will end up being in part on Fawcett property. Okay, I'm going to leave the microphone. Now, one of the challenges you'll see, Catherine, is trying to have something to say when it gets to you. We don't always start at that end.
Well, I have next to nothing to say, because it's all been said before. I do agree with all the comments that have been made. The only one or two points I'd like to make is I should spend more time than I'd like in southern Florida, and I don't like gated communities. I don't like the feel of the gates on the parking areas, because it does feel like it's cutting off everything, all the streets going down. If Brookford is opened, I'm wondering whether there is some alternative. I realize people don't want to cut through from Whittemore all the way through to Mass Ave, but I'd like traffic and parking to think about that again, especially if we can get Brookford open, which I think it probably ought to be. And that goes into the whole access issue about fire equipment and other emergency vehicles. And the only other thing I would really like to see is a better, I think, north elevation that shows the parking in the building, because I don't really see how it's working in this drawing. Other than that, all the issues that my colleagues have raised are ones that I'm concerned about and want to hear more about.
Mr. Chair, I concur with the comments of my colleagues, and particularly Bill. I thought you said it very, very well. And all of the other issues about the massing, about the, I'm not certain that we're getting a real good perspective of what this building looks like to a pedestrian. And I think there may be more to it. And Hugh, I think that you're coming up with some really interesting ways to wrap the community into the external community into the project, so that it does feel like one issue. I want to mention that the rail trails, the old rail beds, offer very challenging geographical terrain issues, because they're built up high and then they've sloped down because the train used to run up on top of it. They're very challenging to work with, and so we have to really work hard with the architect as he designs the border to it. What I want to see is pedestrian permeability. We see it all over Cambridge, and we see it. We don't want this to be a campus. Harvard and MIT have been really, really cooperative about pedestrian permeability as one of their core values. Everybody walks through, and we have to be. I think we have to be able to have that in some sense. That this can't be like walking through somebody's backyard. I think that would be a mistake, and it would set it off from the rest of the community. I also want to close my comments by reading an email April 9th from John Fulop, who's an architect in New York City with John Fulop Associates, Architects and Planners, who says, quote, "The building would introduce a significantly large transient population into the neighborhood that is antithetical to developing a feeling of community," close quote. We've got to stop talking about renters as vermin, okay? Cambridge can do so much better. We're really much better than that. We have to stop talking about rental units as bad. They're not bad. I rent. My son grew up in Cambridge. He rents. It's really, when we start to say certain people who do certain things, we're going to treat them in a certain way, that's dehumanizing people, and we know better than to go there. So I would just ask us all to take a step back from that. Thank you.
Well, it certainly is a challenge going last, but so I do agree with most of what's been said. I'd love to hear from the fire department if they've had a chance to review the plans and if they're comfortable with them. I think the address issue may be dealt with by a change in massing. And if it were broken up into several buildings with several addresses, that might be less of a concern. So I'd like to see some more information on that. I agree with Steve about the pedestrian permeability. I know that that's a challenging slope getting up to Linear Park. I'd like to get more information on how that's going to be achieved, not just at what appears very much to be a private access point that is planned here, but I'd like to see some public access that people can get bikes up to the park from the neighborhood. That's all I have that's different.
Hugh, could I add one or 2 points? Sure. Get another shot at it. First of all, the interesting question of ownership versus rental, I think there are pros and cons of each, but I don't think that the question is within our purview to address. And therefore, I don't think we should address that question. It should be left to the applicant to decide. Another point I'd like to address is the 4 other lots which are designated on the plan, and we heard the intended uses described, but they're actually not part of this application. But I think actually, how they are ultimately addressed is of some interest and concern to us. I think as described, it sounds fine. But if that's how it's being described to us, I'd like to see it somehow incorporated into a decision by way of conditions or otherwise. One other comment I would make, Mark, if in fact you're going to come back and show us some other studies of how this square footage could be organized on the parcel, I hear what Hugh said about how the building actually does look to a pedestrian, and Hugh described it sort of broken up into a series of connected buildings, perhaps. But I must say, when I look at the north elevation, that I'm not seeing that. It looks somewhat relentless and long to me, and so while I think it would be helpful to see how it could be broken up into a large number of smaller structures, I think perhaps another thing that might be interesting and useful to look at would be that if it is going to be a larger structure, whether that elevation could be better articulated to in fact break it up and create the perception of connected smaller structures. And I must admit, and I'm not sure which way this would cut, but looking at elevations frequently, they may be accurate geometrically, but they frequently don't really tell a fair story about what it would actually look like. And in fact, when I look at your elevations and then I look at the perspective drawing that you do in the cover, it doesn't even look like the same building. So you might do yourself justice by showing us more perspectives of this project so we can get a better sense of what it actually looks like.
If you don't mind, I also just, Mark, I just want to say, I mean, obviously you have been before us a lot, and we kind of know your architectural style and the kind of buildings you do. In this one in particular, I go by the Harvard residences in Cambridgeport almost every day, and I think that this one looks like it could fall into that category where you actually have a series of entries and kind of the feel of townhouses, but it is a fairly, it feels like a fairly large and connected building. So I think you tend not to go in and out too much in your buildings, as best I can see. Even though the one on Broadway, I think, I found that interesting, that even though it is a building, but you tend to have a certain flatness even when you are changing materials and stuff. And I think that that might not work as well here, so that's something to keep in mind.